How can I talk to my child?
My students need help.
I really need to talk to somebody. Is this normal?
I don't know how to respond.
What am I supposed to do?
Surely there's training somewhere to handle this.
Hello, I'm Robert Rabin, and I'm privileged to serve as the president of National Center for Youth Issues. And today the topic of our webinar will be responding to and growing from tragedy when it occurs in the school family. We're privileged today to have with us Dave Opalewski, and Dave has spent a good part of his career addressing these types of issues in schools and communities throughout our country. Dave is the president of Grief Recovery in Saginaw, Michigan, and is a certified death and dying and suicide prevention instructor for Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. He is also a certified support group facilitator and child trauma specialist. Dave was involved in K-12 education for 33 years, 25 of those years as a classroom teacher, and 8 of those years as an at-risk counselor and coordinator at a school district also in Michigan. Dave worked for 3 years as an aftercare consultant at a funeral home. During that time, he pioneered the Saginaw County Aftercare Adult Support Group. He is the author of 4 books that address the issues of suicide and grief, including the one that we'll be referencing today, which is Confronting Death in the School Family. Dave's books are published by the National Center for Youth Issues, and he has also published several articles in professional journals. He is a highly sought-after speaker at both state level and national conferences and has conducted numerous workshops in school districts throughout our country. Dave is currently a full-time instructor at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. I've had the privilege of getting to know Dave over the last several years, and I quickly recognized his passion for the work that he has been called to do. And Dave, thank you for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to see you again, and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with us on this very important topic. You know, as research shows that schools often face the death of either a student or staff member in their school.
Robert, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm just very happy to be able to help my colleagues help our kids go through some very difficult situations.
Well, Dave, let's get started. Let me ask you this question first. How and why did you get involved in this area of work? It can sometimes be quite depressing, I'm sure.
Well, yes, most people would think so, and it's a line of work where I think if you really liked it, something probably would be wrong with you, but I've been around the death and the grief issue, it seems like pretty much my whole life. I lost friends when I was a young child. When I was in high school, just after high school, I had friends come back from Vietnam who were killed in the line of duty. My mother contracted cancer in my late adolescence, died when I was an early adult. My first year of teaching, I had 2 students die and a staff member die suddenly in my first year of teaching. Later on, I was a replacement teacher for a teacher in our school district who was killed in the middle of the school year. In fact, in 33 years of K-12 education, I've experienced the deaths of 28 students or staff members. My advisor for my master's degree, when I was working on my first master's degree, suggested that I take a death and dying and suicide prevention class. And from there, I went on and wrote my first master thesis, Death Education Guidelines for Classroom Teachers. Because all through these experiences, I was very, very dissatisfied with the way schools handled these situations. They brought in counselors, and that isn't what children or anybody needs at the time of tragedy. What they need first is comfort, and the counseling part comes later. After my first master's degree, my thesis, the local funeral director wanted me to come to work part-time for him as an aftercare consultant, and I did for 3 years, and I learned a lot from those families of the deceased. They taught me a lot about grief. 4 years after that, I met this lady who was widowed, and she had 2 small boys, and we were supposed to go out on one date because it wasn't supposed to work, and God's got a sense of humor, because 6 months later we were engaged to be married, and I adopted the boys. And my wife and 2 boys taught me a lot about grief, especially grieving children and their needs. As time went on in my educational profession, I became an at-risk counselor and coordinator the last 8 years of my 33 years, and I worked with several students who had loss in their family. I became a support group facilitator for grief. I became a support group facilitator for survivors of suicide. And these are just a few of my experiences, and I want you to know, Robert, I'm still learning every day.
It sounds like you've had a lot of experience with this issue over the years. Would you consider yourself an expert?
Well, you're right, I've had a lot of experience. But no, I would never consider myself an expert. In fact, I don't believe there are any grief experts, Robert. If grief is a unique experience to every individual, and all the experts say that it is, how can there possibly be such a person as a grief expert?
Well, Dave, let's delve a little bit deeper into this issue. What do you think are the 3 biggest myths about grief?
Wow, Robert, there's a lot of myths about grief. But I guess as I think about the 3 biggest myths, the first one that comes to mind is people think grief is the problem. Grief isn't the problem. Grief is the solution. A person has to hurt if they're going to heal. And if a person doesn't grieve or improperly grieves, that's hazardous to this person's health and personal relationships. So grief is the solution. It's not the problem, first of all. The second myth, I believe, is there's a lot of people out there that believe that time heals all. And that's not necessarily true. I believe it's what we do with time that will bring healing. Not the fact that it's just going to get better over time. It's what we do with that time that's going to bring healing. And the third myth is grieving is a sign of weakness. I'd like to turn that around and say that it is a sign of strength. It shows me that that person has courage to face a very difficult situation, to admit that they lost someone that they loved. I believe it's a sign that this person has a heart, and a heart that has a capacity to love people. So grieving to me is a sign of strength.
Dave, we mentioned earlier that you are the author of the best-selling book, Confronting Death in the School Family. Based on the research and the experience you gained from developing that book, what would you say are some of the basic fundamentals that schools should keep in mind when addressing these issues?
Some very basic fundamentals, Robert, include, first of all, at the time of tragedy, what students and staff need most is for comfort, not counseling. Their greatest need is for comfort. What I find is that we have to touch the sensory part of a person first before we can go to the cognitive. And the cognitive is the counseling segment. In my research across the country, of thousands of students I've asked who they would want to talk to following a tragedy at school, 82% of them indicate that they would like to talk to their classroom teacher. And I find that very interesting because their classroom teachers aren't counselors, but they're comforters. And that is their greatest need. Their greatest need is for comfort, not necessarily counseling. The counseling comes later. In many schools, they get the cart in front of the horse. They pull in these counselors and they forget the comfort first. The second fundamental is when tragedy strikes a school, it's a school family issue. It's not just a guidance department issue. Every adult in the building can be a very valuable resource in these times of tragedy. You don't have to have a counseling degree to comfort people. I believe teachers have a role, secretaries have a role, administrators have a role, as well as counselors having a role as well. It's always better when the entire school family is involved and they don't dump on the guidance department. Your third fundamental is you have to care for your staff. If we expect our staff to care for our students, we have to make sure that we have a plan in place to care for them as well. When I was coming down here yesterday and the pilot was backing out of the pedway, the stewardess is showing us how to put a seatbelt on and where the exit rows are. One of the things that's a great analogy is if the cabin loses its pressure, oxygen masks fall from the ceiling. What are we supposed to do with ours before we assist anybody else?
Well, I think you're supposed to put the mask on first.
That's right. And we have to help our staff put their oxygen masks on so they can assist their students. That's a very important fundamental of a plan. And the fourth basic fundamental is have procedure and policies worked out ahead of time. Have your plan worked out ahead of time. It's very important because sometimes we can be caught off guard. And because we're so emotionally upset, it just opens up the door for the possibility of us making mistakes greater than ever. Also, if we have policies and procedures in place before a tragedy, it allows for us to be more consistent in how we respond from one tragedy to the next, so people don't perceive us as showing favoritism between one person over the other. So these are some very, very important fundamentals that schools need to have in place.
Well, Dave, thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm particularly intrigued about the point you made about planning first and how important that seems to me, so that whenever a tragedy does occur, that you're not floundering around about what to do, that there are certain triggers that happen that cue other things to happen in a situation like this.
Well, in Grief 101, Robert, we learned whenever counseling someone who's had a great loss, try to convince them not to make a major decision for at least 1 year following the loss. And I think that same principle holds true for schools or any institution that's not ready for a tragedy and gets blindsided by a tragedy.
Dave, thank you for sharing those wonderful examples with us. I know one of the things that I'm taking away from today's interview is that we need to be as prepared as we can to deal with issues like this when they do arise. And as we're starting to close out today's interview, would you like to share some final comments, please?
You know, our responsibility is to teach our students a whole lot more than just content area subjects. Our job is to teach our students about the compassion of the human spirit and how in tough times we care for each other. And we need to be an example for our students.
Wow, Dave, thank you for sharing those powerful closing comments. And it's been such a pleasure to be with you today. You can just tell that this is a work of passion for you, and the experience that you've gained over the years have prepared you to be involved in this work in such a meaningful way throughout our country. And as always, it's a pleasure to see you. And thanks again for being with us here today, and I hope to see you again soon.
Well, Robert, it's an honor to be here. You're most welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today, and I hope this time has been beneficial for you today as it has been for me. And let's summarize some of the key points that Dave made as we close out our time together. Grief is a unique experience for all individuals. Grief isn't the problem, it is the solution. We must hurt in order to heal. At the time of tragedy, we must comfort before we counsel. When tragedy strikes a school community, it is a school family issue, not just a guidance department issue. Research and experience prove that students would rather work through these tragedies with the adults they see every day at school and have established relationships with. Schools need to have a plan in place before a tragedy occurs. If you are interested in bringing Dave to your community or reviewing the resources that he has developed, please select the appropriate icon shown on the screen, or you may contact us at 1-800-477-8277. Thank you again for joining us.